Hello, my name is Christian Hunt and welcome to my session as part of Risk Awareness Week. Now, I am here to talk to you about what makes us risk aware. What are the factors that drive our perception of risk? And you'll notice that my company is called Human Risk. That specializes in the subject of risk that people cause. And I'll come on and give you the definition in a second. But the fact that I look at that means I'm also well qualified to talk through some of the factors that we as individuals perceive when we are assessing risk in a situation. And we'll look at some of the reasons that we sometimes get that wrong. So with all of that said, let's kick off with the definition of human risk, the thing that I help my clients to mitigate. And I define that as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. So a very, very broad definition. Now, the reason I have that broad definition is that I think it's really important to recognize there are a range of things that we can do or not do that can pose risk to ourselves, to our employers, and to society as a whole. And you'll notice in the definition, it talks about doing things or not doing things. Very vague definition there. Obviously, the word things, not something we normally see in a definition, but I wanted to capture the full spirit of all of the potential things. I use the word things because I don't always know what those might be. Notice also doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. We often tend to think of risk as being people taking risk, making mistakes, placing bets. But actually, if there's something really important that you need to do, maybe lock a door, for example, and you fail to do it, that can pose just as much risk. So when we think about humans taking risk, we think about action, but actually inaction can be just as dangerous if the thing that we're not doing is really important. And it gets a bit more complicated, which is why we have this cube in front of us. Because we talked a bit before about active, so doing things to pose a risk, but there's also passive. Just not doing anything at all can pose a risk if the thing you're not doing is critical. And then let's think about knowingly taking risks. So I know that I'm not doing something I should or doing something I possibly shouldn't that's excessively risky, but it's equally possible to do it unknowingly. We can make mistakes without even realizing it. If you ever watch one of those sort of comedy shows where somebody leaves a trail of destruction in their wake, there's a really good example of someone unknowingly taking risk. And then, of course, there's motivation. People deliberately taking risk or potentially accidentally doing it. Both perfectly feasible. We've all been there and done that in some regard. And then, of course, when we think about risk, the other challenge we have is that we very often identify with the person that is left holding responsibility for whatever's gone wrong. Person kind of holding the proverbial package when things go wrong. That's the end of the race here, little individual running. But it's also possible that actually risk can be caused by someone else, someone at the start of something. So if you have a system that's been badly designed, then actually the person designing it can cause mayhem later on down the line. And so we might look to the individual that is crossing the line, that's holding the thing when it goes wrong. But actually it's not their fault at all. It's the fault of the person over here. And it's a really good illustration, this example of human risk, of the sorts of challenges that we can face when we start to think about the dynamics of what drives risk. All of these factors come into play. And then when we shift into the real world of human risk, what does this mean? Let's have a look at some examples of the sorts of things where we see risk occurring, people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. In other words, miscalibrating the risk. If we are causing human risk, it means we've miscalibrated some way, shape, or form. And so my favorite example comes from 2017 in the Oscars. And this gentleman just above me here, Brian Cullinan, who was a partner at accounting and consulting firm PwC. And he had one job on the night of the 2017 Oscars, and that was to hand out the envelopes to the people that had won awards. And you can see the red envelope there, almost as red as Brian's face, because what we're seeing here is an instance of him having handed the wrong envelope out for the biggest award of the night. It's like the one time if you were going to do that at the Oscars, that's the award you really wouldn't want to do it on. Not that you would want to do it anyway. And so you've got this big fuss in a very public situation, embarrassing, of course, given the firm that he works for, because he is there representing a firm that audits people and advises other people on systems and controls and risk management. And yet here you've got a really good example of that not being enacted in a very public way. And what's really interesting about this case study is that when we look at what went wrong, and there's been a lot of things deleted, but of course the internet has a memory. There were pictures that Brian Cullinan tweeted from backstage, and he was apparently told not to tweet things. Nonetheless, did it, got carried away in the moment. So he tweeted pictures of actress Emma Stone with her award just as she came back off stage. So really cool pictures from his perspective, but obviously he was distracted, or at least that's the impression that we get. And so he handed out the wrong envelope. And so there's a really good illustration of someone with years of experience miscalibrating the risk that was there. And in fact, he'd spent the couple of weeks before doing lots of PR, talking about how the task on the night was, well, it looks relatively simple, he said. You just have to hand out the right envelope. But it's actually quite complicated. And so here's a really good illustration that even if we've got tons of experience, we can make very simple mistakes. He didn't set out to cause a huge problem, but that is what happened. So we can see that seniority and experience doesn't necessarily help us. And then here's another example of an individual misjudging risk, if you like. This is a gentleman called Kweku Adeboli, who was a rogue trader at the Swiss bank UBS. And full disclosure, I used to work for UBS. In fact, I was the regulator that dealt with the Adeboli situation from the other side of the fence. So I'd become a financial services regulator in September 2011. And then a few days after I'd taken up this position, responsible for supervising international banks, so the bit of the regulator that faces off against the industry, I dealt with the aftermath of what had happened. And he had been engaging in unauthorized trading that had got into the billions, at one point into the double-digit billions. It was down sort of in single-digit billions by the time his work was discovered. But still pretty serious stuff. He ended up going to jail as a result of this. And what is really interesting is the letters that he wrote to an FT journalist while in jail, where he says, I fought the trial not because I thought I would win, because no one in finance ever realizes how close they are to the imaginary transitory red line until they cross it and get smashed in the face by a million camera lenses. The word sorry notably missing. But what we've got here is an illustration of somebody that did something they really shouldn't have done, who went to jail for it, who has recognized that they may have misjudged the risks. So here's an illustration of where a relatively junior person, he's a mid-ranking trader, can cause absolute mayhem in the 21st century. Technology empowers people to make mistakes in a big way, and we'll come on to look at how technology impacts our thinking about it. But it's another illustration of the sorts of challenges that we face, which is people often don't think about the risks. They take risks and then they get things wrong, not particularly risk aware. And we can look at this quote from the then UBS CEO, Sergio Amotti, who came into post after Adeboli's handiwork became known. His predecessor, Ozzie Grubel, resigned and Amotti was given the role. And he said something interesting in 2017, which was the riskiest part of our business nowadays is operational risks. We can have hours of discussion on credit or market risks. So those are traditional sort of banking risks. But the one thing that really hurt in the last 10 years of our industry is op risk, operational risk, not credit or market risk. And operational risk is basically everything that's not directly related to finance. So it's things like fraud, cyber, reputational risk, those sorts of things that aren't directly related to banking, they're sort of consequential or secondary risk, as it's known. And he says here, if you do something wrong as a bank or you have people doing bad things within the bank, costs you much more than any credit risk or market position. Really interesting illustration there that the riskiest part of banking, he's saying, is not the banking, which is quite a bold statement, but I get where he's coming from. Because when things have gone wrong in financial services, it's tended not to be in the core business. It's people thinking about, or not thinking necessarily, but making mistakes in other areas. So good illustration there that we can see that the challenges are not necessarily the things that we really know, the technical stuff, but elsewhere. So some interesting dynamics. And when we look at these mistakes and these problems that have occurred, it leads to natural tendency. Why do humans get these things wrong? And mistakes, of course, are a misjudgment of risk. We didn't take the right amount of precautions at the time. Maybe we didn't take enough risk, or maybe we took far too much risk that drives these errors. And so I always think it's helpful to look at what is going on in here when we want to think about risk management. So if we look at the human brain, one of the challenges of the human brain, and I refer to the human algorithm because I look at what's going on in here like an algorithm. We're taking data in through what we see, through what we hear, through what we know, what we smell. All the senses are kicking in to tell us things. And then it goes through an algorithmic process and produces an outcome. And the challenge with the human algorithm is that we can't upgrade our hardware. We've got no capability to enhance our brains just yet. We can't reprogram our software, much as we might try. We come with human OS. And so there's not much we can do about it. So all we can really do is control the data that goes into the algorithm. That's what's driving the decision making. So I look at human decision making as a data problem. It's the wrong data is going in, which is producing the wrong answer. So if we don't perceive a risk properly, we've got, for whatever reason, we don't have full awareness of the risks that we're running. That's a data problem because the algorithm is taking the wrong information in and therefore producing the wrong answer. And so why does that happen? Well, the human brain is programmed for efficient decision making. It's not programmed to make the best possible decisions. It's programmed for efficient decision, get things done quickly. And that's very important from many, many situations where we need to be able to decide quickly. If you're trying to cross the road, if you were processing all the data, how quick are the vehicles moving? You wouldn't have time to do that. So we have to rely on shortcuts for efficient decision making. And so there are two ways that our brains think. And these are detailed in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he talks about system 1 and system 2. And that's very sort of logical. It's also very difficult to remember. So I prefer a formulation here by Dr. Zoe Chance from Yale. And I'll plug her book in a second, where she says, look, we have two ways of thinking. This is not left brain and right brain. It's just two different ways that we draw conclusions, that we make decisions. And so she talks about the alligator and the judge brain. And if you want to tie that back to Kahneman, alligator is system 1, judge is system 2, but you don't need to know that. Just remember alligator and judge. The alligator, as the animal, just makes quick snap decisions. If you've ever seen an alligator, they go for it. They just respond to the environment very, very quickly. Lash out if you're in the wrong space. You will know about it. And that's our fast, unconscious, intuitive, emotional, and habitual brain. So quick reactions to get things done. But we also have a judge sitting in our heads who is a bit more slow and conscious and deliberate and effortful and infrequent, doesn't sort of jump in all the time, but when it's necessary, the judge can appear. And so we have these two different ways of looking at the world. A very simple way that's just very quick and responsive, useful if in emergencies, and a more thoughtful, deliberative process where we need that and maybe the time allows for it. And so if we think about those two systems, we can see in a really simple example how they kick in. Before I tell you that, let me just plug this book that Zoe Chance has written that comes up with this concept of alligator brain, gator brain, and judge brain. Influences your superpower, thoroughly recommended, great for working out how do we all influence other people, really, really powerful bit of writing. So that's where you get this idea of alligator and judge. And so, well, what does that mean? Let's take a simple maths problem, or math for those of you in North America watching this. And an example would be 2 times 2. And there we can use our alligator brain to tell us the answer. Now, one of the reasons that we can respond really quickly is it's super simple. 2 times 2 is not a difficult calculation to do. And it's not difficult because we do it all the time. Lots of things come in bundles of 2s. And so we're used to knowing that the fact that 2 times 2 is 4. We can see it all around us. We buy cans that come in packs of 4, maybe bottles of beer that come in 4s. We know that number. We know intuitively. We don't have to do the calculation. We know the answer instinctively because knowing your 2 times table is incredibly useful. And so knowing 2 times 2 comes naturally to us. But on the other hand, if I said to you something like 17 times 67, that is going to cause most of you, myself included, to be scratching your heads a little bit and thinking, what is the answer? I'm not going to tell you, you can work it out for yourself, but that process that you are going through to calculate it is your judge brain in action. Very slow cogs in most cases as we get to the answer. And of course, part of the reason for that is that we don't really need to know a 17 times or a 67 times table. That computation is not particularly helpful in most contexts. If we have to do it, it's going to be a very unusual set of circumstances. So let's not waste brain capacity in trying to memorize the answer to that. And so there's an illustration of the judge brain in action, that slowing down that you can feel as you try and get to the answer. is the judge brain in action. So these two brains, incredibly helpful, where we have complex challenges for the judge brain and really easier ones for the alligator brain, means we can respond to the different situations that we have in the world. But the trouble with the way that our brain works is that we jump to conclusions very quickly. If the alligator brain can get on the pitch to solve a problem, it will. Very keen to snap and react. The judge is much more deliberative, and so it doesn't want to be participating in decisions if avoidable. And so when I show you something like this, and this is from Germany, and this is basically looking at COVID cases over a 7-day period, and you can see that here we've got the April 2021 stats, and over here we've got the March 2021. If you're in the US, you're probably confused. We do the days slightly differently, so we have day, month, year, as opposed to month, day, year. So, for example, here, this is the 17th of March 2021, as opposed to the third day of the 17th month that doesn't exist. Now, why am I showing you these? Well, what's really interesting is if you look over here, your brain is going to tell you that things have got worse to what you can see over here, right? Instant reaction is, oh my God, things are getting a lot worse, until we sneakily look down here. Because if I show you here, look at the scale that's there, and then look at the scale that's there, you can see that they're using a slightly different set of scales. They've added a whole load of new things. And so we're not comparing like with like, but our brains very quickly jump into that. So when we're calibrating risk, we're taking in information as we see it. The Gator brain is jumping in and telling us that things have got worse, and it hasn't necessarily. It's just they've changed the colors. But of course, we're not thinking in those terms. And so one of the challenges when we take risk and we assess risk is that we often jump to quick conclusions, that we perfectly logical to assume that this is the same shade as this because it's the same broadcaster that's produced the charts, and yet they've changed the scale. You could say sneaky, but I can see all sorts of arguments why they might have done it, but nonetheless doesn't help us in our interpretation. Facts that we sometimes see don't neatly present themselves. And I'm going to show you something now that will seem really offensive. So apologies to anyone that's immediately offended by this, but roll with this. Because what you've got here, this is by an artist called James Victori. Really, really interesting guy. He was a copywriter who became an artist, now works with people to help them be more creative. He's been on my Human Risk podcast if you want to hear him talk about this. This is a piece of art that he's produced. And on the face of it, you're thinking, this is really rude. And why is this vulgar thing being presented to us? And of course, that's because your brain has jumped to make a presumption about what it is probably saying. And congratulations, if you didn't make that presumption, I certainly did the first time I saw it. Because what's clever about this is, of course, there are lots of possible options. It may not be the thing you think it is. It may be go feed yourself, go find yourself, go free yourself. Totally different nuances, but our brains will jump to the top thing you can see on the screen now. So this quick brain, this Gator brain, means that we can often misjudge situations, jump to conclusions, and sometimes that'll be right, but very often we can draw the wrong ones. We're programmed to take quick decisions, but actually maybe we should take slightly slower ones and think about alternative options. And nowhere is that better illustrated than this picture here. So let me pop myself right on top of his finger for amusement's sake and say to you, look at this. What is this telling you? Well, you know who this is. This is Prince William, now the Prince of Wales. So next in line to the throne in the UK this year. We obviously had a change of monarch, so he was second in line. He's now first in line. And this was taken a few years ago. And you can look at this and think, well, he's gesticulating to the press. It's a very rude sign that he's making to the press. And we know that the royal family has had incidents and challenges with regard to the press. So it's not surprising that he might be responding in a slightly vulgar manner. And then I'll show you this, and you can suddenly see that it's not what it looks like. He is signaling how many kids he's got. It's a positive message to the press. But of course, we've seen it from one angle, and we've probably drawn conclusions, the same conclusions in many respects that we see here. We think we know what we're looking at, but actually it's not everything as it seems. And we need that second camera angle to give us the information that allows us to assess what's happening. The trouble is, in the real world, we don't have that second camera angle. We very often get shown something from one angle and we make a decision. And so from a risk perspective, that means that we're lacking really, really valuable information, and that means we can misjudge what's happening. The Gator brain kicks in and we misjudge things. And there are situations where that's perfectly innocent and perfectly fine. So here we go. This is classic 2020 video calls into news studios. You've got two journalists reporting on things in the Middle East, and you can see what is shown on screen. And then if you see what's underneath, the reality is they're both in kids' bedrooms. So a beautiful example of something called what you see is all there is. All that we see is what we think is the entirety of the universe. The information that we have, we are good at making decisions based on the info we have rather than additional sets of information. And that means we're never thwarted in our thinking. We can make quick decisions. But as we've seen with many politicians recently, they can make decisions without looking at all the different angles, without considering every possibility, because the thing that kicks in and allows us to think like this, in other words, what we see there is everything. And in this case, of course, it doesn't matter. But we don't think that there might be something else there. And so we're watching a TV news item. It doesn't matter what's going on in the room behind the reporter. But imagine you were taking a decision where you had to look at these situations and say, what's going on? You're unlikely to conclude that they're in a kid's bedroom. And although that's not a realistic situation for anyone to have to deal with, that can happen quite frequently. We just take what we can see or what we can hear or what we're aware of, and we draw simple conclusions. That's how our brains are programmed. So when it comes to thinking about risk, we're not necessarily as risk aware as we might think. We are not fully in possession of all the facts. We're used to making decisions without it all. And of course, the opposite is true. We can be overloaded with information, have too much, and draw the wrong conclusion. But we're very good at taking the data sets that we have. What we see is all there is, as opposed to the data sets that maybe it'd be a good idea to have. So let's put that trick to use again and have a look at one of the classic ways that we can be manipulated into misjudging situations. And so here is an opinion poll that was put to two different questions put to the same group of people at the same time, just a few minutes, maybe seconds after they were asked one, they were asked another question. The question they were asked was, would you support reducing the voting age from 18 to 16? At which point 37% went no. Went yes, we love that idea. 56% no. Very clear majority in favor, against this thing. I'm already confusing myself, as you can see. Right? Very clear majority against this particular piece. Bad idea to give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. And then we come down here. Remember, same question, same audience, same survey. How about we give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote? Suddenly 52% in favor, 41% against. Same question. You get entirely a different answer. Now, not everybody has changed their mind, clearly, but enough people have to change the minds of the majority. And so the opinion has been swayed by the way the question has been asked, the way it's framed, the context in which it's the information of the question has been asked changes people's opinions. And so if we think about that in a risk context, very, very easy to see how we could get things wrong. The way information is presented to us could determine how we perceive a risk and therefore how risk aware we are. And one of the challenges that the human brain is good at, so it's positive in the one sense, but negative in the other, is that we are very good at shutting things out that we're familiar with. Right? Brain capacity is valuable. It takes a lot of energy. The brain uses something like 20% of our standard energy usage when we're not under stress, which for the size of it is quite impressive, right? There are other moving parts of the body where you would think it would need more than that. And in fact, what happens is we try and use our brains as little as possible. And what that means is when we see things or come across things that we've come across before, we can shut it out. We don't need to focus on it because we know what it is. Very good in a world that doesn't change much. And so they've conducted experiments, and this is from a book called The Runaway Species by Anthony Brandt and David Eagleman, highly recommended, that illustrates what happens when you put a brain in an MRI scanner, presumably with a human and a body attached to that brain, and you present it with a new stimulus. So think a sound or a picture or just something that's going to stimulate the brain. What happens is for the first few times, a ton of activity going on in here that is the brain processing what is going on. What is this thing that I'm being presented with that I'm unfamiliar with? And the more it's presented, you can see the level of activity in the brain goes down because we get more and more familiar with it. And so the third repetition of it causes a lot of activity here. You can see a lot of red stuff going on in the brain, lots of things thinking. Sixth time of seeing it, still some things going on, but much less. 12th time, really, really starting to see that shrinking. And then by the time the 24th repetition of this thing, you can see that the brain's not really processing at all. Really good way of saving energy. But if you think about this in terms of habits, this is how they happen, right? We start off and something is challenging for us. We have to think about it, we have to concentrate to be able to do it to start with. Think about a diet or an exercise regime or anything really where you're trying to change a habit. A lot of exercise effort to start with, literally and metaphorically. But the more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more we get used to it. Great if you're trying to build new habits, right? Develop, it takes a bit of time and effort, but we can see where it goes. Terrible, of course, if you are doing bad things. If you're committing crimes, you might notice it to start with, you feel guilty, and then after a while, you don't notice that you're doing it. Lying is another good example. We can get used to lying frequently, and then it becomes perfectly normal for us. So depending on what it is we're shutting down in the brain, that can be good or bad. From a risk perspective, of course, what it means is we haven't got all of our critical faculties if we're looking at things we've seen before. And so if we're in a situation where we've done something lots of times before and it hasn't killed us, then our brains say, well, that's okay. We've survived. So it must have been a good decision on some level. So interesting illustration of repetition suppression can help us because it means we don't have to keep using our brains. We can make quick decisions. On the other hand, from a risk perspective, kind of dangerous. And then one of the other things that we do as humans is we look at things from our perspective. Very natural, right? We understand where we're coming from. So here's an illustration of two little gentlemen, both of whom are arguing about what it is that is in front of them. And they are both, of course, entirely correct from their own perspective, and of course, entirely wrong if you think about it from the other person's perspective. There is, in this case, of course, no right or wrong answer. But you can see that the sort of the joke here is clearly that they are both correct and both wrong. And that is how often we operate. We take things from our perspective. We don't think about the fact there might be another perspective, because why would we? We're looking at the world through what we know. And so from a risk-taking perspective, that can be very positive if what we're seeing makes sense. But if our perspective is skewed, it can be a bit more challenging. And so there's a really good example of that from the Second World War. And I want to, again, give credits to Jordan Ellenberg, a book called How Not to Be Wrong, The Hidden Maths, with an S, my American viewers, of everyday life. And in this book, Jordan Ellenberg is basically doing a big promo for maths and how great it is to help us solve problems. I'm not very good at maths, I hasten to add. So I found this book to be fabulous. So if you're not, still worth a read, really interesting. And one of the stories that he tells in that, and you can find this online, by the way, on Medium. There is an excerpt from this book where you can read effectively the chapter with this bit in it. The story he tells is from the Second World War, and he talks about a Hungarian gentleman called Abraham Wald, and you can see a picture of him down here. And Wald was working for the US military as a mathematician to try and help them solve problems, military challenges reduced to mathematical problems. And so they were asking Wald to help them reinforce planes. Many of the planes that were going out into Europe, primarily from the UK, weren't making it back. And they were trying to work out how to reinforce these planes. And so they gave Wald the data. They had the planes, they knew where the planes were being shot at, and they had the data. And this little picture here is supposed to represent the sorts of data sets that they had, all the places that planes had been hit. And so the idea that they were toying with was to say, well, okay, we've got this data. What we need to do is we need to strengthen the planes in the places where they're being hit, and that will make things safer. And Wald said, you're misjudging the data set that's in front of you. Because what you shouldn't be doing is strengthening the planes in these parts. And that was the question he'd been asked to solve. How strong do we need to make the planes? He said, you're misreading the data. The data you've got in front of you is actually the data of planes that have been hit and made it back. In other words, where the holes are is where planes can be hit and they can still survive. What you can't see is the invisible data set of the planes that haven't made it back. And his hypothesis was that it was the parts of the planes that they couldn't see, the bits that were not hit on these planes that they had in front of them, that were actually the vulnerable points. So far from strengthening the bits that you could see the holes in, strengthen the bits where you can't. Protect those bits, because that's what's the data set that you can't see, the planes that aren't coming back, that you can't get hold of. That's what they would tell you was his hypothesis. And so they fortunately listened to him. And it made one heck of a difference. Lots more planes started coming back, because what Wald had identified was the data they were sitting on was telling them one specific thing, which is where you can be hit by bullets and still return. And that was being misinterpreted as this is where we need to strengthen it. And if they'd done that, they'd have got it wrong, would have continued to lose planes. And so Wald brilliantly recognized the challenges of the data set that was in front of him. So really good illustration here of risk management being done intelligently, because someone stopped to think, well, what does this data tell us and what data might we not have? The moment you realize that there's missing data, you can make a better decision. You can be more risk aware. And that was the challenge here. They were going down the wrong route. Fortunately, they hired a really smart guy who put them back on track. And I think that's just a really interesting illustration of how data sets can play into risk management and the way we perceive the risk of a particular situation. And I mentioned this book before, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So he's the really godfather of all this thinking. Fabulous book. One of the most purchased and least read books. A little bit of a interested. Jordan Ellenberg did a little bit of an interesting study of books that people had bought on Kindle and how far it seemed that they had read. And Thinking Fast and Slow was a thing a lot of people had bought but not read that much of. It's called the Hawking Index if you want to look into that. Anyway, amazing book. Fortunately, I have read it, so I can tell you what it says. And this is the place where you'll find out all about thinking fast and slow. This is the Gator and the Judge thinking. So system 1 and system 2, as Kahneman calls them. This is where all this stuff comes from. And what he says in this book, amongst a whole load of other insights, it is the consistency of the information that matters for a good story, not its completeness. Now, he doesn't mean stories as in storytelling, as in fairy tales, stories we tell ourselves and we tell other people to justify our decision making. The consistency of the information that matters for a good story, not its completeness. In other words, we're all about narrative and not accuracy. Indeed, he says, you will often find that knowing little makes it easier to fit everything you know into a coherent pattern. So in other words, ignorance is bliss because we don't have to worry about these conflicting bits of data that we have bouncing around. Very simple, straightforward narrative. Have a look at the world of politics and see some of the solutions that politicians have proposed that sound incredibly simple, that play exactly to this dynamic. Right? We like really simple solutions. And of course, the world is not simple. It's complicated and challenging. And so if we want to think about risk, very often what we can find ourselves doing is coming up with simple narratives that sound good in our heads because we are fusing together limited pieces of data. Maybe we've excluded bits of data that are a bit awkward. We focused on them, or maybe we only have limited bits of data and then we draw conclusions. So very good at telling ourselves stories, making stories and narratives from data that we have rather than potentially from data that we should have. And so ignorance in many respects can be bliss. And that is best illustrated by this gentleman here, who's called MacArthur Wheeler. And in the 1990s, MacArthur came up with a cunning plan for robbing a bank. And this is a picture of him from the CCTV, slightly grainy because it's obviously the 90s, but you can see what he's doing and you can recognize him. And you might think, well, why would you rob a bank looking like that when you're going to get caught, right? But MacArthur had a cunning plan, and MacArthur's cunning plan was that he had disguised himself. He was going to make himself invisible. And the way he was going to make himself invisible was to use lemon juice to make invisible ink, and the invisible ink would be on his face, and he would therefore be invisible. Now, that is clearly utterly stupid, and unsurprisingly, MacArthur Wheeler was caught very, very quickly after having attempted to rob the bank because his face was on CCTV, and the police managed to find him relatively quickly. And what was astonishing about MacArthur Wheeler is that he didn't understand how they could have caught him. He was absolutely convinced that his cunning trick with lemon juice was going to save him because they weren't going to be able to see him. He was invisible to the camera. And he said to them as the police arrived, he said, but the juice. And this story made the press in the article back there. Robber's trick, a lemon, very clever journalistic play on the word of lemon, meaning something poor, poor quality. And so two academics, Dunning and Krueger, decided to look into this because they were like, how can somebody be that stupid that they don't know what's going on, that they don't get this? They didn't actually say stupid. That's my abbreviation of it. But you get the point. Like, how can you be so silly to think this would work? And they discovered something called the Dunning-Krueger effect. And what you can see on the axes here is level of competency along the x-axis and level of confidence on the y. And so the Dunning-Krueger effect, and this isn't a mathematical representation, it illustrates a simple point that we all know and understand. When I have no knowledge, no competency of something, I start off with a position of very low confidence in my ability, right? Because I don't know anything in a particular field. And it's very, very easy to get ourselves to a position up here, where with a little bit of knowledge, we can start to think we really know stuff. A little bit of knowledge is, as they say, a dangerous thing. And so you can see this in sports, you can see this in new hobbies, you can see this in people, technical areas where people think because they've got a small amount of expertise that they've got it sussed. Teenage drivers would be a good example. A little bit of driving, I can handle this. And of course, they haven't got the experience, and so awful things happen, hence insurance premium are quite high at that age. And then the more we glean about a particular subject, the more we realize actually we don't really know anything at all. It's much harder than I originally thought. And then actually we pop out the other side when we do know what we're talking about. And it's all a little bit easier for us because we've become genuine experts over time with the knowledge that we've accrued. And so this Dunning-Krueger effect, which is beautifully always summarized as you're so stupid you don't realize you're stupid, but that's a bit of a simplification, is looking at this idea of how much knowledge do we have, and therefore what's our level of expertise. And the challenge, of course, comes is that we don't necessarily know what level of knowledge we have, and we can misjudge that, and therefore misjudge the level of expertise that we have. So really easy for us to misjudge situations. We think we're better at things than we are. If you ask a load of people how good they are at driving, generally you get in these surveys that most people think they are above average drivers. And that illustrates the point. Not everybody can be above average, and yet everybody thinks that they are. We have this inbuilt degree of confidence, which can lead us to misjudge things and therefore not be as risk aware as we might like. And that, of course, is us backing ourselves. And sometimes we take cues from other people. We don't know ourselves, and maybe we'll take some hints from other people, and that can be challenging from a risk perspective as well. So I want to take you to the Louvre Museum in Paris and have a look at something. And there's a clue up here as to what we're looking at, which is this is the view from the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. And if you've ever been to the Louvre, you will have seen the Mona Lisa, because it's a bit weird not to go see the Mona Lisa if you're there. It's the most famous painting in the world, pretty much. And so what we see in this gallery is, look at all these people along here, and they are all, with the exception of this guy here, I presume it's a man, all credit to him because he's looking in the opposite direction. He's actually paying attention to what else is there. But everybody else is either looking at the Mona Lisa or just having a conversation about how amazing the Mona Lisa was. And one of the things you'll know if you've been to see the Mona Lisa, it's actually really disappointing. Like, it's a tiny little thing. It's a teeny little picture. And really, it wouldn't stack up on any level. It's not impressive at all. I've been to the Louvre about 50 times because I used to live in Paris. I used to love going, and I've seen the thing about 2 or 3 times, and then enough. I don't need to see it anymore because it's very disappointing. But you can't go to the Louvre without saying you've seen the Mona Lisa, because everybody else has seen it. We know it's a famous picture, and it's famous because it was involved in a robbery. It was stolen and suddenly became famous as a result of that. So a bit of FOMO there. This picture that's very small was taken. People were curious as to why, and then it came back. And there's a whole story involving Pablo Picasso, which is quite interesting about that and his potential involvement in the theft of the Mona Lisa. But what happened there was that it became famous, and now we can't go to the Louvre without it. We're judging it not based on artistic merit, because if you look at the pictures you can see around my head now, I mean, this, for example, way more impressive. But nobody's looking at that. Everybody's looking at the Mona Lisa. We are copying what other people do. And so if we do it in an art gallery, you can imagine that we would maybe do it in other situations where we'll misjudge the risks that we are facing. And we see that happening in lots of situations. So this, for people in the UK, this happened in 2021. There was an issue with having tanker drivers refilling petrol stations or gas stations for North American viewers. There was a problem with that. And everybody was told by the government not to panic buy fuel, which of course led to them panic buying fuel. We copied what other people were doing and like, oh my God, and they announced on the news that there was panic buying. So there was more panic buying. We all fell into this habit of copying other people. And there was no need to panic buy. If people hadn't panic bought, there wouldn't have been a problem. It was the panicking that led to the problem, which led to more panicking, which led to more of a problem. And so there's an example of people misjudging what other people are telling them. If I see lots of other people are waiting in line for something, I might do the same thing, and therefore misjudge what is going on and misjudge the risk that I'm facing. So real live illustration, taken to a ludicrous extremity by this, which was a mortar tanker. So this is to do with putting bricks and building houses. Mortar is a substance you use for building. And that was this tanker drove around. It looks sort of like a fuel tanker. And this driver found himself, he was delivering this mortar to various places and found himself being followed by people in cars who thought he was a fuel tanker. And then they got angry with him because they found themselves nowhere near a fuel station, but just having followed him blindly. And of course, the more people that were following him, the more got onto the back of the line. So we copied what other people did. Total, again, misjudgment by copying other people. So very common for us to do those sorts of things. The other thing that can fool us is context. And so I'm going to show you an illustration of how a context can make us misjudge things and therefore miscalculate the risk. So the first thing to talk about here is this is a coffee chain that you will have heard of, and they use a clever trick called the decoy effect. So if we imagine in a simple world that we just have two different types of coffee that we sell, let's call them short and tall, because that is what this coffee chain used to sell. And so when most people come in to buy coffee, they may not know what they want, and if they're not sure, they're more likely to buy the small one. You're more likely to buy the short than the tall, because I don't want a load of coffee. I'm just going to have the simple, the smaller amount. So I know if I want to buy a tall, I'll buy a tall. Most people go for the short. And what they realized was if they added another option, then of course some people would buy that option. So they added grande on as a third option. And so some people do buy that coffee. But what magically happens is people who aren't sure, and potentially the large majority of people come in and go, I'm not sure what I want. They go for the Goldilocks option. So neither too small nor too big. And they go for that middle option. And so by adding that third coffee option, what they've actually done is, yes, they've sold a few more coffees at the large end of the spectrum. But what they've done is taken the average purchaser from the short into the tall, right? You go from the small end of the spectrum to the one in the middle. The one in the middle feels like the safest option. And so what our decision is influenced not by what we want, not by a perception of what's there, but actually by the context in which it's presented. So the same decision, we might come in and we buy a totally different coffee because of the other coffees that were available. Same trick with wine lists, by the way. The restaurants add some really expensive wine to make the next ones down look more expensive. Look more reasonable. And so the ones at the top are just there to be there. If somebody wants to buy them, that's great, but they're not there for that purpose. They're there to make the next ones look reasonable. Those are the ones possibly the highest margin. And the coffee shop took it one stage further, because what they then did was they thought, well, okay, we can continue doing this, right? So if we can drag people up the scale of buying larger sizes of coffee, maybe we can do that again. And so they moved by getting rid of short. I mean, they didn't get rid of it. They just hid it under the counter. So you can still order shorts. Check this out, by the way. If you go into a Starbucks, short is not an option that's on the menu. It doesn't exist. But you can order it. They have the cups available. They will sell it to you, and it's there and available. So anybody that wants it can buy it. But what they did was they added this extra size venti, the first sort of bucket-sized coffee hits the menu. And what magically happens is everybody that was going for middle option, when it was just short, tall, and grande, tall was the middle option, the Goldilocks option. Suddenly grande becomes the Goldilocks option. So again, you're upselling coffee. Some people will buy the vat of coffee over here, but the purpose it serves isn't to sell too many of them. The purpose it serves is to shift people from here, from here over to here. So very cunning plan that it changes the answer to the question based on the context that we can see things in. Very, very clever. You can see movie theatres or cinemas, as we say in the UK, similar trick, slightly different dynamic with popcorn. And if you look at the pricing of the popcorn I've got hypothetically here, so small is 4, medium 6.50, large is 7. And so the logic, traditionally you go, well, let's go for the middle one, right? The Goldilocks option on popcorn. And then you look at the prices and you think, wow, if I'm going to go for the middle one, I might as well go for the big one. So again, playing with our choices by looking at the other things that are there. And that also applies to risk situations where we might find ourselves misjudging the risk because what's around us will make us think about what's there in a different way than if it had been presented on its own. So data that we take into the human algorithm sometimes heavily influenced by the context in which we see it. And then we make things worse in many cases by some of the tools and the ways that we do things. So here's just a few examples of how we inadvertently make things worse when it comes to perception. And if you want to know what I think the biggest root cause of bad decision-making in business, it is Microsoft Office. Other pieces of software available, others are just as awful, but I pick on them because they are the market leader. And they had that really irritating paperclip thing back in the 90s, if you remember that far back. Clippy, go away, apparently coming back, by the way. But why do I think Microsoft Office is terrible? Well, let's have a look at PowerPoint. You'll have noticed I am not doing a presentation using PowerPoint slides. I hate PowerPoint, awful piece of software. What does it do? It encourages us to put bullet points up on a slide. Nobody wants to sit there and read bullet points. You want to see pictures that will stimulate you. What's the point in me doing a presentation if I'm just going to read from bullet points? So PowerPoint encourages this awful behavior, and I don't think it's particularly powerful. And then email, of course, terrible thing. Email is, as it was described by Tom Chatfield, who's a fabulous writer on things like productivity. It's a to-do list generated by other people. We allow people to send us things and send us instructions about what we need to do. So I blame Microsoft Office for many of the ills of the world. We've got software that makes us think in bad ways. It doesn't allow us to prioritize things. It sticks us in a rhythm. Not great from a risk management perspective when we're trying to prioritize lots of different perspectives. And then let's go to an average meeting. Here I am, sat there in my suit. Hello. You'd be very lucky to catch me wearing a tie these days. I will occasionally do it, but let's, for the purposes of illustration, remind ourselves of what it would look like if I were wearing a tie. I'm in a meeting. And what do we do in meetings? Well, we go through lots of formulaic behavior. We make decisions in a very regimented way. We turn up, we get the agenda. First thing we do on the agenda is we read the minutes. Now, if you think about reading the minutes, it makes perfect sense. We are saying, well, what did we agree last time? Have we done the things we said we do? Very logical. But what it also does is it reminds you of the last time you got together. It's framing the meeting you're about to do in the context of the one that you did before. And of course, that's great if the meeting last time was amazing. But most times what it does is it reminds us of the god-awful experience we had last time round. And so when we go to series of meetings for projects and things, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that they all feel the same, because we set them up as reminders of what we did last time. And then we go through a very formulaic agenda, not desperately exciting from a creativity or from an open-mindedness perspective, because we're going through the motions time and time again. We have processes that we put in place. Why do meetings last an hour? Well, the answer is we used to drag people to a physical room where if you asked someone to go to a physical room, you were going to have to kind of, let them bring coffee, and you can't really get someone in a room for 5 minutes. So we need to get them there for an hour, and we fill that time. We don't need to do that anymore, and yet we stick to these traditional techniques. So processes can drive us into bad decision-making and therefore not being as risk-aware. And then let's have a look at how many risks are presented to us. This is a classic risk dashboard that you'll recognize. Red, amber, green. So green things, good, going well. Amber, not sure. And then red, danger. So what do we do with this thing? Well, we look at it and we say, that's nice. Let's talk about the reds. The reds are screaming danger, danger, danger. We need to focus on those. So most of the time in the meeting, we'll talk about the reds because they're the bad things. And we won't bother talking about the greens because that's all good. And what's interesting is we then end up in the repeat of that meeting, we do the same thing, right? Let's talk about the reds again, and it's the same things, and we repeat ourselves. It's Groundhog Day time and time again. And of course, reds are known problems. If it's red, somebody knows about it. What's potentially more interesting is what is lurking in the green. What's the stuff that's never gone amber or never gone red? Because that's much more likely to be a surprise risk. And yet we don't do that. We focus on the reds first. We talk about the things that we know are problems that we've talked about a million times before, and don't focus on new things. So the structures that we use can drive us to make bad decisions that way as well. And so not as risk aware as we might like. And then let's talk a little bit about data. So I talked about the human algorithm. We need the data to go in. Of course, it relies on us having a nice data set that's representative of everything. And as Caroline Criado Perez in her amazing book, Invisible Women, cannot recommend it enough, talks about, we have lots more data on men than we do on women. Men have been in leadership positions for longer, not because it was meritocratically so, but just because, well, patriarchal society. And so the data that we use to make decisions is very heavily skewed towards men. And you can look at other groupings of people. Ethnicity would be another example where there is much more data on white people. My attributes, much more on that than on certain other people's. And that means that we're making decisions based on the wrong data set. And of course, so judging things by the data sets of the past doesn't necessarily help us solve the problems of today or the future. We've got data sets that are there. All data comes from one place, the past. Past is not necessarily reflective of the present or the future. So very, very dangerous. And then when we think about data, we can talk a little bit about technology. And we've all aware of this, the power of the GPS, the power of the machine. And loads of people who do stupid things, slavishly follow the GPS unit, crash into rivers because the machine can't be wrong, only it can. And technology makes us do weird stuff. And so actually we outsource a lot of our critical thinking to machines. Right? We don't need to read maps anymore because our phones will tell us where we are. But how many times have you stood there trying to work out which way the little blue dot is facing and potentially gone in the wrong direction because it's mislaid you? Or in the case of what happened here in Colorado, lots of drivers were trying to find a way out of a road to the airport that had an accident on it, and they all ended up going down a track that was undrivable just because Waze and Google Maps told them they could. Technology makes us not think as much as we could do or should do, and therefore poses more of a risk. We're less risk aware in many cases because the tech is doing the thinking, and sometimes that's great because it's doing thinking we can't, but we're very conditioned to just take what it says. And if I stretch that into the metaverse, if you put one of these little things on, as you can see, you can't really see anything about the real world. Let me try and get this actually on my head. There we go. So you can see this lovely headset. Great fun, by the way, if you haven't tried one of these. Awesome, but it's not the real world. And we do weird stuff. And there's stories of people engaging in all sorts of naughty behavior in the metaverse because it's dehumanizing us slightly. So again, from a sort of behavioral perspective, not great, but from a risk perspective, we probably take more risk in those sorts of settings. So things like electronic trading, electronic gambling, cryptocurrencies, all these things, increased risk of us doing things that we might not do in the physical world, less risk aware because we're not in an environment we're familiar with, and lots of the cues that we would normally take. For example, physical cash, you can see how much money you're spending, much harder in digital currencies. So we've kind of blitzed through a whole load of dynamics that mean we're not really good at this stuff. So what can we do to ethically hack these dynamics? Big on ethics I am when it comes to this sort of thing. So what can we do to ethically hack it? Well, first thing we can do is we can take our cue from Cara Delevingne here, who is not cracking under pressure. When we're under pressure, we make bad decisions. We've all seen it. Don't go food shopping. When you're hungry, you will buy more than you need. Pressure makes us do stupid things. So we try and remove as much pressure as we can, put some extra space and pauses into things to try and enable us to make better decisions. That'll make us more risk aware. And then we need to think a little bit about the data we've got. So here's an ad from Colgate. And you can see that what it's basically saying is, look, the most noticeable thing on this picture here is what is between his teeth. Very powerful if you're looking at advertising dental floss. But what you haven't probably clocked is that he doesn't have an ear. The mouth is really significant because we look at it and we spot it. We don't spot other things that might not be there. This same couple gets a little bit older in the next ad that they run. And you know what the trick is now? You're going, well, what is it? Of course, the first thing you're drawn to is what's in his teeth here. So a bit of dental floss would help that. And the weird thing in this picture is, of course, this extra arm. Whose is it? And the answer is it's no one's. But it's not the first thing you notice. So again, a risk lesson there. We're often focused on looking what we think we're looking for. We look for the evidence for the thing we want to be true or to the thing we're looking for rather than thinking about other bits that might be there. And of course, this couple gets older. So let's have another look at the ad in this series. Again, we're drawn to his teeth. You can see there. And the question you've got is, well, what is it they've added in the picture? This time, not immediately obvious. Well, I'll show you what it is. Have a look at the hand that's down here. A few fingers that aren't normal in this particular situation. So again, we are distracted by what we're looking for, not the things that we perhaps ought to notice. And so as we look at the world that we're in, we need to be focusing not just on the risks that we know, but the unthinkable risks. Great ad here from Mercedes highlighting some of these systems they have in their cars to help deal with unexpected risk. So here, the kid's doing a delightful thing and potentially causing all sorts of trouble. The picnic is probably not going to land well. So good illustration there of unexpected risk occurring in a system that can manage it. Another one from the same series. I love this. So nice little catapult here. It's probably going to hit the bees, maybe hit the horse. Not going to end particularly well, so that nothing happens even when the unthinkable happens. And we often don't think the unthinkable. Lots of things that we think were never going to happen suddenly did. People got voted in, elections, referenda went a particular way. Outcomes that we never expected actually took place. And so very important to be thinking about those unthinkable things. And we're not naturally trained to do that. And so what can we do about it? Well, another lesson here is to take a cue from Jeff Bezos. He talks about anecdotes. I like the idea of anecdata, so that when we have anecdotes and data together, we know what is happening, the data, and we know why, because of the anecdotes. And so Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, says, the thing I've noticed is when the anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes are usually right. There's something wrong with the way you're measuring the data. Anecdata, combination of those two things, anecdotes plus data, bang, together gives you more of a chance. We tend to look just at data, not great on its own. Equally, anecdotes can be crazy in left field. We probably need some data to calibrate those as well. So very important. What else can we do? Well, cognitive diversity, really important. So here's a Benetton ad. Remember, visual diversity is only one thing. Cognitive diversity requires different ways of thinking. We want neurodiversity, different ways of people, different skills and thought processes so that we can see things through different angles. If we just look through our own perspective, chances are we miss things that may be blindingly obvious. So, quick summary then of the 5 ethical brain hacks to help you deal with all these problems. Slow down if you can. And if you recognize you're being asked to make a decision very, very quickly, that's what con artists do. Remember, see if you can find a way to slow it down. Quick decision making, or get someone else to calibrate it. Quick decision making poses huge risks. So to the extent you can, slow down. Ask what's missing. What data do we not have? What is this data not telling us, so that we understand what it is we're looking at and we can be more intelligent about it. Think the unthinkable. So many examples of stuff that we said would never happen and until it did. So got to watch that really carefully. Cognitive diversity, huge. Bring in lots of other different opinions. Get people who think differently to you to opine on stuff. You will get better decision making if you have more opinions and brains on it. Do not stuff your boardroom table with people that all look and think the same way. That is the danger route. Finally, use anecdata, very important. Remember, not just data, which tells you what's happened, but anecdotes that can tell you why it's happened. You need the balance of both. Which takes me beautifully to my final slide. And I say on this, what questions do you have? You can pose those through the platform and we'll get back and answer those questions. If you're interested in this stuff, I have a newsletter currently in hiatus, but coming back very, very soon. You can subscribe to that just by taking a picture of the QR code. It'll take you through. Finally, if you want to connect with me, if you've enjoyed this presentation, got some questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search for Human Risk and you will find me there. I wish you all the best for the rest of Risk Awareness Week. Fabulous initiative. Delighted to be part of it. Hope you found this useful. Thank you so much, and I'll see you very soon.